ahead and welcome everyone. We'll continue to let folks in from the waiting room as we get started. We are excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session today. Thank you for joining us. To save bandwidth for all of attendees, we ask everyone who's not presenting to turn off their cameras and to mute themselves during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat, so you can share any questions or comments you have to share with the presenters there, and I'll go ahead and voice those. Mark Broughton is running tech for us today. Thank you, Mark. As I said, we're recording this session. Alice will share it in a follow-up email later this week. If you are uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and then just private message Mark with your name for attendance. Also, if your Zoom name doesn't match what you registered with, if you could also let Mark know that so we can make sure we've got you on attendance, and that way if you need a certificate, we can make sure we get that to you. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. And in just a moment, I'm going to put a few links in the chat about land acknowledgements and about those people groups. And I'm going to go ahead and transition to welcoming our speakers today. We have Kara Richardson, Meredith Nisbet, and Katie Bendel. They're with the Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Centers, and they're going to be talking today about finding body inclusion in outdoor spaces. We are so happy to have you with us today. Welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. So again, my name is Katie Bendel, and I'm a community outreach liaison for Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center. I just wanted to do a very quick overview of who we are for those that are not familiar. So we offer a full continuum of care for eating disorder, mood, anxiety, and trauma-related disorders, from at-home or virtual care, or intensive outpatient care, all the way up to inpatient or in-person 24-hour care. And we have 35 centers across the country, plus nationwide virtual treatment. So we are in Texas, but we're also in other states across the country as well. I just wanted to highlight on the bottom half of this slide, you'll see that in addition to our treatment services, we do offer a wide variety of free community resources. I've provided a brief overview of some of those on this slide. I want to highlight our nearly 20 free virtual groups for mental health, which are open to the community at large. Events like this one occur all year round. We also have our Mental Note podcast, which offers stories, knowledge, and empowerment for those working on their mental health journey or supporting someone who is. Lastly, our social media communities are designed for folks to receive support, inspiration, and updates about mental health resources and events. If you are interested in learning about any of our treatment services or our free resources for anyone in the community, you're welcome to reach out to us at the websites listed below, and then the phone number on the far right-hand side, which is 877-825-8584. And I also want to thank, again, Texas Children in Nature Network for partnering with us on this event today. We're really grateful for their collaboration and allowing us a space to talk about how weight stigma and outdoors kind of come together, and mental health, how that all blends together. So thank you again to Sarah and the rest of Texas Children in Nature Network for that. Meredith, and if you can go to the next slide. So I just want to take a quick moment to introduce our speakers. So first up, we have Kara Richardson Whiteley. Kara is a plus-size adventurer, influencer, and advisor, and the author of Gorge, My Journey Up Kilimanjaro at 300 Pounds, which is being made into a movie with This Is Us actress Chrissy Metz, producing and starring as her. She is a contributor.
Uh-oh, Katie.
I might have briefly lost Katie. She'll be back in a moment, I'm sure.
You want me to finish reading for her? So I'm also a contributor to Backpacker and Outside Business Journal, and I have helped brands such as Ella Bean Keen, Discovery Puerto Rico connect with the plus size audience, but most importantly today, I am a mental health advocate with Eating Recovery Center Pathlight. Meredith, do you want to take on your bio?
I will take on my bio. I'm Meredith Nesbitt. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified eating disorder specialist supervisor. Currently, I'm serving as the National Clinical Response Manager for ERC Pathlight, and I kind of manage the team of folks who are taking initial inquiries of patients, families, and providers who are seeking care with us. I also have a private practice with Three Birds Counseling where I see eating disorder patients and couples. And I also provide education, training, and consultation on weight stigma and size inclusive, fat positive care around the country. I earned my bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and my master's degree in marriage and family therapy from East Carolina University. And I currently reside in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Awesome.
And we will get things started.
Let's do this. So if we want to talk about our agenda today, we've got a few objectives here, but of course, our idea here is to talk about body inclusivity in the outdoors. First, we'll start with moving mountains, a personal narrative, that would be mine. Body inclusivity on the trail and off. We've got the physics of movement, weight stigma, ways to be more inclusive, and of course, we want to end with happy trails. Next slide. So my claim to fame these days is that my book Gorge is being made into a movie with This Is Us actress Chrissy Metz. It all began because at one of her book signings, I admired her work so much that I wanted to share my story with her. Not to make a movie, but because I knew it would resonate with her and, the characters that she'd play in This Is Us. And when she sent me an email with how moved she was, I knew that there was a larger platform to be telling the story. And so everything that I do as an influencer, as an author, as an advocate, as an advisor, it's all about sharing that human experience of somebody who lives in a larger body, who wants to move mountains. And so in the context of this conversation of inclusivity in the outdoors, I'll be talking a lot about a mountain called Kilimanjaro. It's Africa's highest peak. But when we're talking about inclusivity in the outdoors, we're not talking about such grand adventures. We're just talking about experiencing and loving and being part and welcome into the outdoors. Next slide. And so just keep in mind also, if questions come up for you, whether you want to put them in the chat or ask us afterwards, no question is too weird because I'm a memoirist. So you might just be giving me material for my next book. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I want to kind of get an idea from you, all of our wonderful participants, of what is a proud body moment for you. If you can take just a second and write it in the chat, that would be super helpful. When is a time that you felt really proud of your body? When I can get out of my kayak without help. That's one response. See if any others come through. Any other thoughts about what is a proud body? When I ran a mile without stopping. When I was able to push myself further than previously. When I walked El Camino. When I went walking around the top of Pikes Peaks with sea level lungs. There are so many amazing experiences and kinds of ways to experience the outdoors. So when we talk about inclusivity in the outdoors, it's not just hiking. It's not about these massive Everest climbing, those specials you see on Disney Plus. Sometimes it's just the act of being outside, collecting leaves, making, an ice lantern. There's so many fun ways that you can experience nature. And so, whether it is doing all the poses in hot yoga, finishing a long trail, trying out for Olympic softball team, all these wonderful responses that you've put in the chat. being in the outdoors, it doesn't mean there's not one kind of movement. Okay, next slide. And know also that this journey is incredibly complicated. I share my story as what I call a plus size adventurer, and also my complicated relationship with food, because I know that when people look at me in the outdoors, or they read my books, or they see me on a TV spot, they carry a lot of assumptions about my body. And I know that it's very common that we carry assumptions about other people's bodies. And so that's why I'm so open, and I often share my story with other people. Okay, next slide. In fact, that the landscape of the outdoor world is a little bit difficult to navigate. This was an actual Google search for hiker girl. And I don't look like any of these folks. In fact, when I started to hike, when I went to outdoor stores, even the socks were too tight. In the next slide, if you wouldn't mind sharing that, you'll see that I'm here at the top of, or near the top of Eiger Jungfrau and Jungfraujoch in Switzerland. In this image, I'm wearing a men's jacket and jeans when it's freezing cold, simply because at that time, there wasn't anything else that fit me. And so, you know, when we talk about accessibility and the ability for people to experience the outdoors, there are so many different barriers, which we'll get into soon. But I want to talk about, you know, my journey as one human experience of the outdoors. And so a lot of people talk about how I've climbed Kilimanjaro 3 times, right? But that journey began at the bottom of a staircase, the bottom of the staircase where I could barely make it to the top. And a lot of people, when I tell that part of the story, they wonder, how did you get to that place? Where did you where did you let things go? There's all this strange language that comes with people's bodies. Like, how did you let yourself go in that way? And the truth of my history, my story, is that I had a very complicated and traumatic relationship with food and body. I struggled with something called binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder is not talked about a lot. It's the most common eating disorder. In fact, there's more than twice the amount of people with binge eating disorder than anorexia and bulimia combined. The first time I remember binging was when I was 9 years old and my parents were fighting in the other room. They are on the verge of divorce. And I would literally hide in the pantry. And the chewing would literally drown out the sound of their fighting. And I kept coming back to food as a way of calm and peace amid the chaos. And, you know, this is a pattern that continued for me. And instead of learning how to deal with the stress of life when things got really, really difficult, hard, challenging, like as a kid, I always felt like the bottom was going to fall out of my life at any given time. I would always turn to food and that binging behavior for, you know, traumatic events such as I had an assault, you know, I was a latchkey kid, I was lonely, and it turned into everything from the highs and the lows and everything in between, where this behavior really consumed a lot of the joy and all the other things that I could experience with the highs and lows, the resilience, the things that, you know, maybe in life that I was supposed to learn. And so when I got to this point where I could barely make it up to a staircase, I was feeling incredibly lost, disconnected, you know, detached emotionally from a lot of the things that brought me joy and peace and care about myself. It was a long time coming of many, many years of depression, of binge eating disorder, and woven in there was a history of anorexia and depression and anxiety dovetailed into that. And so oftentimes these diagnoses, they're not so simple. It's not just like, oh, you know, she just eats too much and she, you know, she doesn't exercise enough. It's not that simple. I had an eating disorder coupled with anxiety and depression. And so when you look at somebody's story, when you look at somebody's body, you don't necessarily know the narrative. And for decades, I lived like that. And most importantly, for decades, I hid those behaviors from other people. And while some people might say that it manifested with how I looked in a larger body, I hid a lot of my eating patterns. I hid a lot of the shame. I took it all internally. Next slide, please. So one day I got an adventure travel catalog in the mail, and I was about to turn 30 because back then I thought I was getting old. And so I started to look at these pages. In fact, I think I've got one right behind me, these glossy images of Machu Picchu, Kilimanjaro, the Alps, all these amazing, glorious places that one could go to. And I realized that I was living in this narrative of like, I'll do that when I lose weight. I would say to myself, I had these lists and journals of all the things I was going to do when I lost weight. I would get a new wardrobe. I would see the doctor. I would, get a makeover. I would go on a vacation when I lost weight. And since at the time I thought I was getting old, I thought, well, wait a minute. This never happens. Like my weight never really changes. It doesn't matter what I do. It never really changes. So what if I just became an adventure girl? What if, even though I don't fit the mold, even though the only thing that I could buy at the, outdoor store, the only thing that I really fit was like a Nalgene bottle, the kind of water bottle that if you and the bottle fell off the mountain, it would survive and you wouldn't. Like I could get one of these to get started. I could get a book on like the 50 hikes of New Jersey. I live in New Jersey where there's a lot of flat hikes, a lot of places where you could just get started and just put one foot in front of the other. And in the beginning, those beginner or like easy hikes were like climbing Everest to me, because I was not only carrying, the weight of a larger body, I was carrying so much anxiety of what people would think of me, anxiety of like, what's going to happen next? Am I going to be able to deal with something that comes along on the trail, a bear, a person who's going to say something mean? And so I remember this 20-minute hike, as such a monumental occasion. I must have packed in my backpack like 3 days supply of food in case I got lost, which is really silly because like I live in New Jersey, and if I got lost, I'd probably end up in like a Target parking lot. Okay. But I was ready for anything because I was terrified that the worst possible thing could happen. There are so many hurdles emotionally, physically, sometimes for somebody to take those first steps into the outdoors. And so once I started taking more steps. I got to the end of that first trail and was so elated that I just started going through the book. Easier hikes, moderate hikes, molehills led to mountains, and every step that I took me to a different challenge. And there were different things that happened along the way. There was such a focus on the trail, and instead of constantly thinking about my body as like eat less, move more, I was building strength. I was accomplishing things, and it felt so good. And what I realized, which was most important to me in this whole journey, is that I realized that hiking and being in the outdoors was the exact opposite of my binging behavior. Binging for me was all about pushing away and distancing myself from a feeling, from a fear, from something I didn't want to do, whether I was procrastinating or, I just was scared of something or excited about something and I didn't really want to feel how happy I was. But when I went into the outdoors, it was this amazing experience of taking it all in. Because when you go into the forest, you are surrounded, and you have to accept the challenges of what lies ahead on a trail. When you're walking in the kinds of trails that I do, you hear everything from the crack of a twig underneath your boot to the canopy overhead, you could even hear the wind. You can hear the air around you. You can hear snow melting into a stream. And like, if, around here, it's going to be muddy hiking because it's been really wet. And so you kind of feel that resistance and tension from, your boots sticking to the ground. If it's an ice storm, it's going to be slippery and you have to be cautious and careful. You don't know what's coming across, coming up around the corner at any moment. And you have to accept that. You have to be ready. And you have to take another step forward, or you're just going to be stuck on a trail. And, I'm all about sleeping in my own bed. So I am not willing to do that. And so what hiking and being in the outdoors taught me to do was to keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. And if something felt off or strange or weird, I had to deal with it in the moment. But the most important thing was that I kept coming back. I kept going forward. These, experiences led me to the top of Camel's Hump, which is Vermont's third highest peak, to the top of Mount Mansfield, which is Vermont's highest peak. And that's a whole other memoir one day, because we ended up going down the wrong side of the mountain. And then to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and thankfully back up again without the assistance of a mule. Next slide. And so as I was taking on all of these trails, as I said, molehills led to mountains. After I did the Grand Canyon, I was looking for something big, really, really big to have as my next step. And I started to think about, what is the biggest challenge? What is the biggest thing that I can take on? What is the highest mountain that you can hike to the top of? Meaning, like, not a technical climb, not Everest. I'd read Into Thin Air. I was not ready for that kind of experience, but actually hike on my own 2 feet. What could I do? And so I decided to take on Mount Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro is Africa's highest peak. It's 5.5 days up, 1.5 days down, assuming you don't go down the wrong side of the mountain. It's like climbing the side of the globe. You start at the equator, or like a couple 100 miles from the equator, and you end up at glaciers. And so it's really like you get to go and experience every ecosystem that's possible in the world in one hike. And so I was ready for this challenge, and I was ready to to put boots on the ground and hike and hike and hike. Now, 5.5 days up. Some of these days are 6 hours of hiking that's rather steep. Some of these days are 10 hours of hiking. That's really just a long slog, but nothing compares to Summit Night. Summit Night is 15 hours of hiking. 15 hours of hiking. Now you've started, almost near the top, right? And it's not just that you hike to the top of the mountain, you're going to hike halfway down. Because the thing about climbing at 19,343 feet, but who's counting, right? Is that every step takes you further and further from your comfort zone. There's half as much oxygen as there is at sea level at the top of the mountain. And so at the beginning of this hike, I started to notice something, that this part of the mountain so mirrored my own recovery, my own steps towards healing emotionally and working on my relationship with food and my body. See, because you start and you open your tent door and there's stars above you, there's stars beside you, there's stars below you. That's how high you've climbed by this point. And so you're walking along with your companions on this trail, and the other hikers and other groups are moving up the mountain, and they look like moving constellations. They've got headlamps on because you're hiking in the dark. And, so they look like moving constellations. The Swahili guides and porters are singing you Swahili love songs and lullabies. You're walking almost like a wedding march, like 1, 2, 1, 2. Because that's how far and how fast you can go at this altitude. You can't go any faster. It's exhausting to just even be. but yet you're walking in lockstep with your group. 1, 2, 1, 2. And it's amazing for the first hour, maybe for the second. But by the third hour, you're starting to question a lot of life choices, like, why am I not the kind of person who books a beach vacation? This is incredibly hard. And all of the things that the porters and guides are telling you to do, they don't make sense because you're walking in the dark. You stink. You're so, you don't even want to know, like you haven't showered in like 5 days. You're exhausted. You're hungry. You want all of the things to go your way, and nothing does, because the side of the mountain is like glorified kitty litter that was frozen. And now with every step, you take one step up, you slide halfway back. You take another step up, you slide halfway back. By the 4th hour, you're starting to write your I quit speech in your head. Like you're so ready to end this whole thing. But you keep pushing forward because everybody else does. And everybody tells you that it's worth it. As long as you don't have altitude sickness, you keep trudging ahead, even though it's hard, it's difficult, it's the most uncomfortable thing that you've ever done in your life. Next slide. And if you keep doing that, you'll reach the summit of the mountain. And suddenly you'll arrive there just as the sun rises, and you'll see how far you've come. You can see that all these people, just like in recovery, they guided you. It didn't seem to make sense at the time, but when you have that view from the top, every step makes sense. Every step makes sense. And in the distance, I could see a mountain that looked just like the profile of Camel's Hump in the distance. And I realized, like, if I had never taken those first steps, whether in New Jersey, in Vermont, the Grand Canyon, I never, ever would have been on this place. Next slide. So everybody started to ask me when I came home from this climb, what's your next adventure, Cara? Like, it wasn't enough that I had climbed Kilimanjaro, and I had this whole other idea in mind of what my next adventure would be. And it would require kind of a new language and a lot of new gear, and that was having a baby. And so in these adventures along the way, from the year before, I felt like I was so in control of my body. I was hiking a lot. I wasn't using food as this emotional fuel. I was using it as fuel. And I thought I was set. I was good, right? But then I got pregnant. And while my oldest daughter and all of my kids, I've got 3, are the greatest gifts of my life, being pregnant was an incredibly, incredibly complicated time. And it didn't matter that it was almost a year before I had my first daughter, that I had been literally the top of the world. When I came home and I got pregnant, I got really scared. And a lot of those behaviors came back. And I didn't resolve them. Instead, I thought, because everybody knew me as this mountain maven, right, that I couldn't talk about it. And some of the most difficult behaviors of my binging disorder reared their ugly heads. I was sleep deprived, which I now know is one of my biggest triggers. And so I would constantly go back to binging to just hide and damp that down. Same thing with financial stress. Financial stress, also one of my biggest triggers. So it didn't matter that I had taken all these steps, that I had done all these adventures for my binging behavior to come back and to present itself, and for nobody to really notice or care or say anything, because they were either afraid to, or I wasn't sharing the whole story with them. Next slide. So after that, about several months of those kinds of behaviors coming back, I realized that I was so absolutely distanced again from the joy, from the present, from the experience, the highs, the lows of life, that I decided that I would go full throttle into seeing an eating disorder specialist. It was important because I was slipping away from the things that I cared about most. And so these days, The path is so beyond recovery, right? For me to adventure, I must be present. I must be focused on like living a life of adventure for my family. I have to find my voice, which one of the hardest things about recovery for me was about like having difficult conversations, whether it's about, I need more sleep, or let's talk about this money situation, or all of those things that are really, really hard. And maybe as a kid, and maybe as an adult, I never quite learned how to do. But most importantly, that I constantly go back to that core, those things, those skills that I learned for adventure, for recovery, to fuel the adventures ahead, so that I can constantly and keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when times get difficult. Meredith?
Thank you so much, Cara. Every time Cara shares her story, I'm blown away just at all that she's experienced and done, and the vulnerability in that. So thank you so much for sharing, Cara. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk more from the clinical side of things, which is my wheelhouse. As a clinician in a larger body, as someone who specializes in eating disorders, and as somebody who enjoys the outdoors and enjoys hiking, not quite as much as Cara does. I set my sights on Kilimanjaro. Maybe one day. My partner talks about that pretty frequently, but we do enjoy the outdoors. And so I want to talk a little bit from the clinical perspective and some of the science about why it's difficult or it's intimidating for folks in larger bodies to get out into the outdoors and to participate in these kind of wellness outdoor spaces. There are a lot of systemic factors. There are also a lot of individual factors. So we're just going to talk about those today. With the physics of movement, I want to talk a little bit about what's pushing us forward and what's pulling us back as folks in larger bodies. So, the things that are pushing us forward to get into the outdoors, to find community, to challenge our bodies in different ways. We might want to be seeking joyful movement. We might be looking to increase our mobility. Like Cara said, she started at the bottom of a staircase and, was having trouble getting to the top. And that's where her journey started. And that's where I think a lot of people's journeys begin, is realizing that our bodies are changing in ways that don't benefit us, and also acknowledging that we can increase our mobility without changing our body shape or size. So we might choose to pursue that. We might be chasing endorphins, that runner's high or that hiker's high. We might be looking to lower our cortisol and process some of the stress that we're experiencing day in and day out. We might be seeking embodiment and connection, an activity to do with friends or with a partner or with a pet, or, just a way to connect with people who also enjoy the outdoors or also enjoy moving their bodies. And I think for, a lot of us, I don't know about those of you listening today, but I myself am a recovering perfectionist. I joke. And it's hard when you get out of the academic sphere, or even once you kind of hit certain career goals as an adult. I think a lot of us find that we have some empty space for goal setting, and we don't know what to set our goals towards or on. And for some people, challenging themselves in the way of getting outdoors or trying new things, starting to hike or to do more challenging hikes, things like that, do help fill that gap and help us give some consistency to our days, our weeks, our months, our years, where we're training for something and we feel a sense of accomplishment personally, that, we're only competing with ourselves. We don't need to compete with others, but that we set a goal, we trained, and that we've achieved or accomplished that goal for ourselves. These are the things that are pushing us into the outdoors, the reasons that we're here. The things that are pulling us back are, some of them are physical things like inadequate clothing and gear options, like Cara's mentioning, even the socks didn't fit when she first was getting into the outdoor world. We need to have adequate gear that does what we need it to do, that fits correctly, that comes in a range of sizes and doesn't stop at a size 20 or a size 24. And also that we have variety, we have choice. We don't just have to take the one jacket on the market that fits us and comes in black, but that we have color and material and size variation, and we can choose. We have that option like folks in smaller bodies do. Another thing that pulls us back in the physics of movement is a lack of fat role models in the outdoor space. We know from the research base that having a lack of role models in general leads to lower self-efficacy, which is where we don't believe that we can do something or that we should do something because there's not a visible sense of belonging or capability. We can't see ourselves there. We don't see ourselves there or people who look like us there. This is also very common for folks in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, where if I don't see myself there, how can I ever start to lay that path to get there, to try that thing? Specifically here with regard to exercise, we don't often or as often see folks in larger bodies in the wellness outdoor fitness space. And so it's harder to believe you can get there when you don't see folks who look like you doing that thing. And then the final thing that pulls us back, and the one that I'm really here to talk about today, is ostracization by others in the community. So one of my clinical specialties is weight stigma, and it's something that I'm very passionate about and spend a lot of time educating and consulting on, and helping folks learn how to debunk weight stigma and how to break that down and create more diverse spaces and create space for that connection and for folks in larger bodies specifically. And so one thing that we know is that higher perceived rates of weight stigma lead to exercise avoidance and also to decrease motivation for folks in larger bodies. I've often joked with my family and friends that, I really enjoy moving my body, and sometimes it's hard to get out of the car. If I'm going to an exercise class or I'm going to go do a hike with friends, sometimes we get there and there's a moment of like self-doubt. Should I be here? Do I belong here? Is there going to be somebody who's moving at the pace that I'm moving? Am I going to be in the way of people moving faster than me? Is there going to be anybody my size in this room or on this hike? Am I going to slow my companions down? And it's something that you learn to cope with, and you learn to in my case, find community and be very open and very vulnerable with the people that you're with. I find that community is the most helpful piece there. But this weight stigma and this ostracization in wellness spaces and outdoor spaces is so important. And I think it's something that the more that we are aware of it, the more we can do about it. And that is really the key to creating more diverse spaces, because, all of these other things, the inadequate clothing and gear options, they're really important, but they don't matter if we're not there in the first place. And so I want to dial us back to the root of how do we make this happen? All of these things that keep us out of the outdoors and away from joyful movement are byproducts of weight stigma. So I'm going to back us up and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So there are two kinds of weight stigma. We have externalized weight stigma and internalized weight stigma. Externalized weight stigma is societal bias towards people in larger bodies, and this shows up in a lot of different ways. The three that are the most impactful, in my opinion, are healthcare, employment, and education. So we know that many physicians associate larger bodies with poor hygiene, non-compliance, hostility, dishonesty, and also a lack of self-control. They spend less time with larger body patients in the exam room, and they're also less inclined to order diagnostic tests when those are indicated. So we know that our healthcare is being impacted. This can show up with folks not wanting to enter into healthcare, not going to the doctor, and it also can impact their experience if they do go to the doctor, because assumptions are being made before they even sit down and have a connection with that medical provider. In the employment sector, people in larger bodies are more likely to have difficulty finding and keeping jobs, and we experience lower wages for the same jobs or performance. We also have lower promotion prospects than our straight-sized body counterparts. And so in general, our earning potential, or even just our potential to get a job, is dramatically impacted by the size of our bodies and the way that that's viewed by society and by other people. In education specifically, I think this is really where we start to see the impact of weight stigma and the development of weight stigma across the lifespan. So we have several studies that ask children pre-kindergarten to rate their self-esteem levels, and they rate them really high for most folks. And then we see this really dramatic drop after school starts, after kindergarten starts. And so in this study, they start to ask them about why that is, what's affecting their self-esteem, why those levels change. And what we find is that self-esteem in this study is lowest among overweight children. I'm putting that in quotes because we don't know what their parameters were for that, who believe that they were responsible for their weight and who believe that their weight was the reason that they had fewer friends or were excluded from activities like games and sports. And so this is really where we start to see the crossover from externalized weight stigma to internalized weight stigma. So we take this external experience, right, that is happening where maybe I'm a child in school and I feel like I have less friends, I'm being excluded from games and sports, maybe I'm being teased for my body or my weight. And I take that experience into myself and I create meaning about it. And that's where the internalized weight stigma comes into play. The internalized weight stigma is dramatically impacted by these external experiences, and we begin to make meaning out of them. We make weight-based attributions about ourselves. We tie our weight to specific things, whether that's self-esteem, whether that's self-efficacy, any of those things. But it's not just a mental health concern. This is not something that's as simple as, oh, well, this person has low self-esteem because they live in a larger body or they were bullied. Internalized weight stigma comes with quite a lot of medical risk. So people with internalized weight stigma have an increased risk of high blood pressure, eating disorders, metabolic syndrome, depression, diabetes, cortisol reactivity, and also weight gain. If any of those, medical complications sound familiar, it's because a lot of them are often associated solely with being in a larger body. And that's kind of a fallacy. It's a confounding variable. Weight stigma is a confounding variable where if weight stigma is present, whether external or internal, we cannot just attribute these medical complications to being in a larger body. We have to acknowledge that weight stigma plays a role there and how increased psychological stress impacts us physiologically and can lead to the development of these medical problems. It feeds this blame and shame game that actually has the additional compounding variable, which is weight stigma. Weight stigma is a form of complex trauma. The reason that we talk about it as such is because it truly is a pervasive re-traumatization for people of size. It's something they go through over and over and over. And so conceptualizing it as a form of complex trauma helps us understand how and why it impacts people in larger bodies and also what we can do about it. So complex trauma is present in multiple settings. It occurs repeatedly over time, and it increases internalization of messages that contribute to negative self-talk and self-image. And so over time, this can cause people to feel unsafe in their bodies. Carr talks a lot about this feeling of binge eating disorder behaviors, of pushing away, of dissociating. And that is a trauma response. Whenever we experience this complex trauma over and over and over, we develop a trauma response, which is typically to either change the body, to hide the body, or to push away, to dissociate from the body. And so this can look like avoiding going out of the house, avoiding interacting with other people, trying to modify the body through dieting or exercise, anxiety about eating with other people, lots of hiding and shame, and ultimately dissociation from the body as the source or a source of trauma is really, really common. And so another impact of this is the avoidance of medical or mental health care, difficulty engaging and being vulnerable with providers, and low distress tolerance for triggers, because patients fear that treatment, or in the case of what we're talking about today, just being around other people in a space that they feel they don't belong is going to echo the stigma that they felt so many areas of their lives. And so it's just this feeling of deep unsafety. That's not a word, but feeling deeply unsafe in spaces that aren't familiar, that they don't have a role model, that they don't know someone. So we've talked here about how people might avoid presenting their bodies in public, and that includes in the outdoors or in spaces that are traditionally focused on movement and exercise, because folks in larger bodies, we often feel othered and unsafe in those spaces. And so this actually reinforces stereotypes that people in larger bodies aren't active or can't be active. And so I want to take some time now to talk about the narratives around health and weight that might be falsely informing the beliefs that we hold about folks in larger bodies. So there's a specific study that I want to show you all, and I'm going to move through a little fast so that we have time for questions, but it is a very impactful one. Before I run through this study, I do want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking about BMI. I hope most of us know that BMI is inherently flawed and racist, but a lot of our body of research uses it. It's still the standard for research on bodies. And so normally I wouldn't use BMI terms or values for this portion of the presentation where we're looking at empirical data. I am going to reference BMI values. So please be patient with me and just understand that it's not an endorsement of BMI as an appropriate or an effective measure of health, but rather I'm meeting the research where it is. We've got to use what we have until we get better. So this specific study, which is done by Matheson, King, and Everett in 2012, looked at the association between what they're calling health lifestyle habits and morbidity risk in a big population-based sample. Now, we have lots and lots of research with big population-based samples. That's kind of the gold standard of research on health. But the difference with this particular study is the stratification of BMI, which I'll move on and show you in a moment. But we can now see with this study how health behaviors impact morbidity risk for folks with higher BMI values compared to folks with median or lower BMI values. So for this study particularly, we're looking at health habits, which include eating 5 or more fruits and vegetables daily, exercising regularly, again, no frequency, consuming alcohol in moderation, again, no specifics, and not smoking. So we can look at these as general health guidelines, and each one is separate. So as we look at this study, what we can see is starting over here on our x-axis, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 health habits. So these folks in this column have 0 of those health habits we just discussed. These folks have 1, these folks have 2, these folks have 3, and these folks have 4, all 4 of those health habits. On our y-axis over here, we have our hazard ratio or our morbidity risk. And then these 3 columns are broken down by BMI. So our folks with the highest BMI, a BMI greater than 30, are going to be in this darkest column here. Our folks in the middle are going to be in this gray column. It might be hard to see. And then our folks in the lower BMI category are going to be in the palest, the white category. So when we look at this, among this giant population-based sample of folks with no health habits, yes, folks in larger bodies do have a significantly higher morbidity risk. But what we see is as we add health habits, this number comes down dramatically. So adding one of those health habits, you could be someone in a larger body who smokes and you could stop smoking. You could cut your morbidity risk in half just by doing that, or by, taking a walk a few days a week, or adding fruits and vegetables more frequently into your diet. Any one of those things. As we add to, we see that folks in larger bodies actually have a lower morbidity risk than folks in the smallest BMI category, or the lowest BMI category. And as we continue to go down, basically as we had health habits, we come out almost even at the end. And so as we're looking at this graph, the takeaway here is truly that increased health behaviors equal better health. And that's true regardless of body size, weight, BMI, weight change, weight loss, that, we can improve our health. We can take steps to improve our health. Aside from dieting, aside from weight loss, aside from any of those things that socially we're told to do when we're in larger bodies. And it's a good reminder that we can't assume someone's abilities or health status solely based on body size. It's simply not possible. We think that we can look at someone and know how well they are, how sick they are, if they have an eating disorder or not. But the simple truth of the matter is that we can't. And so if our goal, it's my goal, I hope it's yours, is to be supportive of folks' bodily autonomy and access to these health promoting activities and behaviors, it's so important that we look at weight inclusivity in these spaces that it typically or historically is not found. And we have to work towards decreasing weight stigma in active spaces in general, but specifically in outdoor spaces.
Unmute myself. So thank you so much, Meredith. I always appreciate the way that you present that information. And, for me personally, it's always my goal is to get more people outdoors. I don't care what you look like. I don't care what your background is, just get outside. And so I thought I'd share these quick tips before we can get to a few questions of how to engage folks in diverse bodies in the outdoors. First and most importantly, lead with the stoke. Like getting outside is all about joy and like adventure and the fun. And so this isn't a punishment. We're not taking people on a long slog to make them feel uncomfortable. We want them to experience the joy. So just lead with that. Find joy and share struggle in all of it. So there may be some tougher times, but you keep moving, and the more you move forward, the more resilience you build. Skip through the assumptions about people who are with you on a hike. I mean, I remember after my second Kilimanjaro climb, some hike leader looked at me and was like, oh yeah, first time on the trail. And I'm like, not really. Or when I go to a spinning class, there's a lot of, oh, was this your first class? It's like, no, I'm in the top 10% of Peloton actually. So, so skip those assumptions about what people can do just based on their bodies. But at the same time, if somebody's new, be welcoming and say, I'm so glad you're here, and please never, ever, if you see somebody on the trail who looks different than you, maybe in a larger body, never, ever say, good for you. It's one of the most cringeworthy moments anybody can have on a trail. Make trail magic, just make someone's experience special. If you see a waterfall down the path and you want to share it with someone, tell them, or pet someone's dog, and have a great time out there. Be kind and bask in the glory of the outdoors. Next slide. There are a growing number of role models out there, a lot of people to follow. These are just a few of my favorites. Her Hopness, who's amazing, an adaptive climber. The Myrna Valeria is one of my dearest friends. She's right next to me in the photo there. Annie Neal is another incredible one. Come Alive Outside is actually an organization that I'm on the board of directors of, and that's, trying to get more people outdoors. So that's a great organization to follow along. Arwen Turner's all the way in the back there in the photo. Seek out a squad, find people, whether they're the same kind of body as you or same pace as you. There are so many different hikers, walkers, kayakers, whatever. You will find people who are your pace or want to be at your pace, and just get out there with them. Next slide. How to help somebody who's struggling off the trail or on. one of the most important things that I try to remind people, because I get this question a lot, is if there is somebody in your life who is struggling with binging or an eating disorder, the most important thing that I've learned is focusing on the behavior, not the weight. And so for me, and when I was a new mom, it would have been like, Cara, I don't see you out anymore. Are you okay? Or, come over to my house and offer to like hold the baby while I shower. Like, it's like all of these things of, like I was really, really struggling. And so it wasn't so much, yes, my body did change when I was binging at that time, but that's not the point. The point is that I was just mentally struggling constantly in these thought patterns that were spiraling out of control. And what I really needed is for someone to help in that way. And also to see, of course, an eating disorder specialist. Ask about how you can be supportive, and know that you might not get an answer the first time. Maybe it'll take a couple times to open that conversation. Know that there's resources, support groups. Eating Recovery Center has some amazing support groups, some specifically for people with binge eating disorder. And Binge Eating Connection is a wonderful resource on Facebook with not only like celebrations, conversations, but information for folks who are curious about binge eating disorder. Maybe they think they have it, or maybe a loved one does as well. Next slide. I know that this is a long trail. I mean, the long trail, is the one that goes between Vermont and in Vermont from the Massachusetts border to Canada. But weight inclusivity and weight stigma and us conquering it is a long trail. And people are really just beginning to have this conversation. So why not be a leader on this trail? Why not walk the walk yourself? Why not show people the way? Because, the more that we're outdoors, the more that we get to experience it and share it with other people. So I'm so grateful that you took the time to, go on this journey with us and are willing to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Cara and Meredith. I know we're running short on time. I know we had planned to do some questions and answers. I think we just have about 5 minutes left. So I thought we might have time for maybe one question. Just as we wrap up here, if anyone has something they'd like to put in the chat, feel free to jot it in there. Just seeing a lot of messages about, thank you and great talk. Meredith, can you go to the next slide just as we're waiting for questions? We have left our information available. So again, at the bottom, you'll see Texas Children in Nature Network. If you want to learn more about their mission and kind of what they're doing to help increase access to increase access for children and adolescents in nature, I encourage you to check them out and support them. And then of course we have information about our speakers, Cara and Meredith, kind of where you can find them if you would like to connect further or ask questions. Oh yeah, let's see, a couple of questions here. Any organizations that help by giving access to hikes? Cara, do you know of anything?
Well, of course, the greatest app is All Trails if you're looking for a hike of whatever level that is. But organizations, I mean, the one, of course, that comes to mind most is Come Alive Outside, which it's a Vermont-based organization, but they have an incredible set of activities that people can do, like having the winter passport and just getting outside. So those are some great ones. American Hiking Society, also a tremendous organization. But you might want to look into things like first day hikes. Those are done by the local, Department of Forestry or things like that, which each state has different ones like that.
Great. And then lastly, maybe Meredith could speak to this. When someone is making cringy remarks, how do you suggest shutting them down or kind of redirecting that conversation?
Yes, so there's a lot of different tactics you can take here. I like to encourage people to think about how much energy they have in responding to that. If you're feeling feisty and you want to engage with it, then And I think this goes for any situation where someone's making uncomfortable remarks, is to ask them to repeat themselves. Sometimes folks are making a comment quietly to you that other people aren't hearing, and asking them to repeat themselves kind of brings clarity to what they're saying, and is a well-timed moment for you to say, like, interesting that you feel like it's appropriate to make that comment, or that that's an appropriate thing to say to someone, and to just kind of gloss over it and move on. Or if you feel like you have the energy to educate, providing some education about why that's offensive, why it's not okay to say to somebody, can be helpful. And if you don't have the energy to engage, take care of yourself first. If you need to excuse yourself to the restroom or change the topic really quickly, I think that that's a very good way to protect yourself. And if you have, what an odd thing to say out loud. Somebody just put in the chat. I couldn't find the phrasing. Thank you for rescuing me. That's exactly what I was looking for. Just kind of like, what an interesting comment to make, and just kind of drawing attention to, like, we should not be speaking to each other that way. It's not okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you. This was incredible. Thank you again to Texas Children in Nature Network. Sarah, thanks for all your work in helping us get connected here. With that, I guess we're at our time. We are so appreciative you were able to make it. Just a reminder that we do have our session tonight at 7 o'clock Central Time as well, that you're welcome to attend. And thank you again, everyone.
Thanks for having
Thank you
us.
so much, everyone. I am going to put our evaluation in the chat. So if you have a moment before you hop off, if you could go ahead and do an evaluation, that would be really helpful. It helps our speakers to know how they did, and then also helps us find new topics as well. Lynn, you're asking about the link for tonight's meeting. It's in the email. It's the same email that you got this link in, so you should be able to find it there. And then also, our next webinar it's on February 1st, and it's about finding clues in local litter to prevent litter. A GIS specialist is going to be sharing about that. So if you're interested in registering for that webinar, we would love to have you. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.